I was 68 years old, standing in the middle of our bedroom in Warwickshire, England, still wearing the black dress I had put on for Leonard's funeral, when I pulled open the drawer of his nightstand and found a phone I had never seen before. Not the old Nokia he used to call the elders, not the Samsung the congregation knew about, a sleek, unnamed burner, tucked beneath a folded prayer schedule, and a copy of the Pofter Watchtower from March 2019. My hands did not shake. That was the strangest part. After 41 years of marriage, after a lifetime of being told that Jehovah sees everything and that loyalty is the highest form of worship, my hands were completely, terrifyingly still. I had buried Leonard 3 days before. The brothers from the congregation carried the casket. The elder who gave the talk said Leonard had been a faithful servant, a man of integrity, a spiritual pillar of our Kingdom Hall in Leamington Spa. 200 people sat in those chairs and nodded. I sat in the front row and believed every word, because I had spent 4 decades learning how to believe without asking questions. That phone changed everything. But it was not even the worst of what I found. Behind the loose panel in his wardrobe, the one he had always told me held damp insulation and not to bother with, there were 2 more, 3 phones in total. Each one a different chapter of a life I was never meant to read. Each one a door he had locked from the inside while I stood on the other side, knocking faithfully, never once suspecting he had built an entire world without me. What I found on those phones did not just destroy my image of my husband, it dismantled the entire structure I had called my faith. My name is Audrey, and I am 68 years old. And I need to tell you this story because I spent most of my life being told that silence is a virtue. In the Jehovah's Witness faith, you learn very early that questions are dangerous, that doubt is a crack in the wall that Satan uses to enter, and that a woman's role inside a marriage, especially a marriage to a ministerial servant like Leonard, is to support, to submit, and to trust in Jehovah's arrangement. I did all 3. I did all 3 for 41 years with a devotion that I now understand was not strength, it was conditioning. I was baptized at 17, at a regional assembly in Birmingham. I remember the feeling of coming up from the water and thinking that my life had a clear map from that moment forward. Meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays, field service on Saturday mornings, the memorial every year, the assemblies, the study, the quiet obedience. Leonard was 23 when we married. He was already reaching out to become a ministerial servant, and the elders spoke about him the way people speak about someone destined for great things. I was proud. I was so proud of him that I mistook his ambition for righteousness. What I am about to share with you is not a story I rehearsed. There are things in these chapters that I have never said out loud to another human being, not to my daughter Petra, not to my oldest friend Sylvia, not even to the counselor I finally started seeing 8 months after Leonard died. This is the first time I am letting all of it out, in full, in order, without softening the edges to protect anyone's reputation. If this is your first time here, I want you to subscribe and leave a comment telling me what city or country you are watching from. It genuinely moves me to know how far these words travel, because for so long my words traveled nowhere at all. If this story touches something in you, if it mirrors something you have lived or watched someone you love live, please like it and share it. You never know who else needs to hear that they are not alone. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Leonard Ashford was the kind of man who always arrived at the Kingdom Hall 15 minutes early. That detail sounds small, but inside a Jehovah's Witness congregation it speaks volumes, because punctuality is treated almost as a spiritual measurement. When you arrive early, you have time to greet the brothers and sisters at the door, to help arrange the literature, to show the new Bible students that this is a warm and organized community. Leonard understood this calculus perfectly. He understood, in fact, everything about the theater of appearing righteous, and he performed it for 41 years without missing a single cue. He had been a ministerial servant since his late 20s, which in our congregation was a position of visible respect. He handled the microphones during the Watchtower study. He organized the territory cards for field service. He counted the attendance and reported it to the body of elders. These are not dramatic responsibilities by the world's standards, but inside the tight world of a Kingdom Hall they mark a man as trustworthy, as spiritually mature, as someone the elders can rely on. The brothers admired Leonard, the sisters respected him. The young men in the congregation looked at him as an example of what a Christian husband should be. I looked at him the same way. That is something I have had to sit with very painfully since his death. The fact that I, his wife of 4 decades, the woman who slept beside him and shared every meal with him and watched him grow old, saw exactly what everyone else saw, and nothing more. I was not a foolish woman. I had raised 2 children, managed our household finances after Leonard's printing company began struggling in the 2008 recession, and studied the Bible with enough depth that I once gave a demonstration at a circuit assembly. But love and institutional trust are 2 of the most effective blindfolds ever invented, and I was wearing both. The first phone, the one in the nightstand drawer, was a cheap prepaid model, the kind you could buy at a petrol station without registering your name. When I turned it on, and I still cannot fully explain why I turned it on, rather than putting it back, except that something in me had already shifted the moment I saw it. The battery still had 40% charge. Leonard had been dead for 72 hours. Whoever had been on the other end of those conversations did not know yet that he was gone, because there were 3 unanswered messages waiting, each one more anxious than the last, each one from a contact saved simply as the letter W. I did not read those messages standing there in the bedroom. I put the phone in my cardigan pocket and walked to the kitchen and made a cup of tea with the mechanical focus of a woman who has just felt the floor drop beneath her feet. I drank the tea. I watched the garden through the window. A wood pigeon landed on the fence post and sat there looking at nothing in particular. And I thought, quite clearly, that Leonard had been lying to me for a very long time. I did not know the shape of the lie yet. I only knew its weight. The congregation visited constantly in those first days after his death. This is standard practice among Jehovah's Witnesses. The friends rally around a bereaved family with extraordinary warmth and practicality, bringing food, offering to help with arrangements, sitting with you so you are never alone. 3 different sisters took turns staying with me that first week. Under normal circumstances, I would have found this comforting. Instead, I found myself in the bizarre position of hosting people in my home while a stranger's phone sat in my cardigan pocket and a dead man's secrets waited for me to find the courage to look at them. The second phone I found 2 days later, behind that wardrobe panel. This one was older, an Android model with a cracked screen protector, and it was password protected. I knew Leonard's patents well enough to try for combinations before it opened. The password was the year of his baptism reversed. I have thought about that detail many times since, whether it was carelessness or whether on some level he expected me to find these things eventually and left me a key. I will never know the answer. What was on the second phone introduced me to a version of my husband that bore almost no resemblance to the man I had married. The contacts list alone contained 37 names, none of which I recognized, organized into groups with labels I had to read twice before I understood them. There were photographs I will not describe in detail because some things, once described, cannot be unheard by the person listening. What I will say is that Leonard had been living a parallel life, not briefly, not experimentally, but systematically, for what the timestamps suggested was at least 11 years. Petra had been in secondary school when it started. We had been pioneering together, Leonard and I, giving extra hours to field service as a spiritual goal we shared. He had stood at the podium of our Kingdom Hall and read scriptures about faithfulness and integrity while carrying this other life in his pocket, literally in his pocket, and no one had seen it. Not the elders, not the circuit overseer who visited twice a year and praised Leonard's example, not me. The third phone was the one that brought the entire architecture down. It was not hidden as cleverly as the others. It was in the lining of an old suit jacket at the back of the wardrobe, the kind of jacket a man keeps for decades without wearing. This phone was the most recent. The last message had been sent the morning Leonard had his stroke. Whatever he had been in the middle of managing, whatever arrangement or conversation had been in progress, ended at precisely the moment his brain gave way. I sat on the edge of our bed, his side, which I had not sat on since he died, and I read backward through months of a conversation that told me everything about who Leonard Ashford had really been, and nothing at all about who I had believed myself to be. To understand why Leonard's deception was able to survive for as long as it did, you need to understand what it is like to be raised, or, in my case, converted young, inside the Jehovah's Witness faith. I say this not to criticize every person who holds that belief, because I know genuine, kind, and sincere people who are witnesses, people who have never deceived anyone and who live with a real and earnest commitment to what they believe. But the structure of the organization creates specific conditions that make certain kinds of deception not only possible but almost architecturally inevitable. came to the faith through my aunt, Beatrice, who had been a witness since the 1950s, and who studied with my mother, and eventually with me starting when I was 14. My family in Coventry was not religious in any formal sense. My father worked at the Jaguar plant and my mother cleaned offices, but they were open to the study, and Beatrice was persistent in the way that only a person who genuinely believes they are saving your life can be persistent. By the time I was baptized at 17, I believed it completely. The end of this system was coming. Armageddon would cleanse the world. The faithful would survive into a paradise earth. Death would be reversed. Everyone you had ever lost would come back. This is not a small thing to believe. It reorganizes everything. Your social life becomes almost entirely internal to the congregation because you are counseled, gently but consistently, that close friendships with worldly people, non-witnesses, are spiritually dangerous. Your entertainment choices are filtered through the lens of whether something promotes Jehovah's values. Your career decisions are often shaped by the counsel that higher education is a distraction from spiritual goals, which is why I became a secretary rather than pursuing the nursing degree I had briefly considered at 16. Your entire sense of self is oriented around the question of whether you are doing enough, serving enough, being faithful enough. And inside all of that, the marriage relationship is presented in a very specific way. The husband is the head of the household, appointed by Jehovah's arrangement. The wife is to respect that headship and support her husband's spiritual lead. This is not unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. Many conservative religious traditions hold similar views, but inside a high-controlled religious environment, these teachings do something particular to a woman's instincts. They teach her to override her own perceptions when they conflict with the spiritual narrative. If Leonard seemed distant, I was counseled to pray harder and support him more. If something felt wrong, I was taught that feelings could be misleading and that trust in Jehovah's arrangement was more reliable than my own intuitions. My own intuitions, looking back, were trying to tell me things for years. There was a stiffness in Leonard that appeared and disappeared without explanation. There were periods when his phone calls were taken outside, which he explained as congregation business requiring privacy. There was the year he began pioneering again, something we were supposed to do together, and then quietly stopped without fully explaining why, which I later understood was because a particular arrangement in his other life had become complicated. I noticed all of these things. I filed them away under the category of female weakness, which is what I had been trained to do with inconvenient perceptions. The congregation we attended in Leamington Spa was a community of roughly 110 publishers, which is the term witnesses use for active members engaged in the preaching work. It was a congregation with a settled, warm culture. People had known each other for decades. Families had grown up together, and there was a genuine sense of belonging that I do not dismiss even now. When my mother died in 2003, those people sat with me in a way that no earthly institution has matched since. Community is real inside Kingdom Halls, and I want to be honest about that, because I am not telling this story to make the good parts disappear. But the community also functions as a system of surveillance that operates through love. When you are that embedded in a group of people who share your beliefs, your behavior is constantly visible, constantly evaluated, and the evaluation is framed not as judgment but as spiritual care. If a sister noticed that you seemed less engaged at meetings, she might mention it to an elder out of concern. If a brother observed something that seemed irregular, the shepherding call, a pastoral visit from 2 elders, was the response. This visibility created, for Leonard, both a constraint and a cover. He could not behave openly outside the congregation's values, so he learned to be absolutely invisible. And because the congregation saw him as exemplary, they never looked closer. I have since spoken with a woman named Constance, who left the Witnesses in her 50s after a similar experience, not with a deceased husband, but with a congregation that had concealed a brother's pattern of behavior to protect its reputation. She told me something that has stayed with me. She said the organization does not produce more dishonest people than any other community, but it does produce a specific kind of dishonest person, one who has learned to perform integrity so fluently that even they begin to believe the performance. I think that describes Leonard precisely. I think somewhere in those 41 years, he may have genuinely believed that his spiritual identity was the true one, and everything else was an aberration, a failure he kept intending to end. That belief, if he held it, did not make what he did to me any lighter, but it helped me eventually to understand it as something that grew inside a particular soil, not as something that fell from nowhere. The faith I had given my entire adult life to had been, among many other things, the greenhouse in which my husband's double life quietly flourished. That is not the easiest thing a person can be asked to hold, but I have learned, at 68, that the truth does not become more manageable by being held at a distance. I did not tell anyone about the phones for 11 days. 11 days of receiving casserole dishes at the door, of sitting through elder visits where the brothers read comforting scriptures about the resurrection hope, of watching my daughter Petra organize Leonard's papers with the focused efficiency she uses to manage grief, and of carrying 3 devices in a shoebox under the bed that contained enough information to reclassify everything we thought we knew about the man we were mourning. The choice to stay silent during those 11 days was not entirely conscious. Part of it was shocked, the specific kind of shock that does not produce visible symptoms, the kind that simply makes you very quiet and very careful, the way a person walks slowly on ice without quite admitting to themselves that the ice is cracking. Part of it was habit. 41 years inside an organization that counsels you to bring concerns to the elders, to resolve things within the congregation, to avoid bringing reproach on Jehovah's name, had installed in me a deep reflex against external disclosure. Even with Leonard dead and his secrets sitting in a shoebox, my first instinct was not to call a friend or a family member. My first instinct was to wonder what the elders would advise. I did not call the elders. That was, in retrospect, one of the first genuinely independent decisions I had made in decades, and I made it not out of rebellion but out of a quiet and exhausted certainty that the body of elders in my congregation could not be trusted with this information without using it in ways that served the organization rather than served me. I had watched enough shepherding calls, had heard enough accounts from sisters who had brought difficult truths to the elders, to know that the response would be shaped first by how the revelation affected the congregation's reputation, and second, perhaps a distant second, by how it affected Audrey Ashford, widow aged 6, who had given her entire life to this faith, and was now sitting on a truth that could embarrass several people above her in the spiritual hierarchy. Because Leonard's connections were not small, by the time he died, he had been recommended for appointment as an elder, a process that had been moving slowly through the circuit's approval structure. The circuit overseer had spoken of him warmly at the last assembly visit. There were brothers in our congregation who would not have wanted that process examined too closely in light of what those phones contained. I understood this instinctively. I had been inside the organization long enough to understand how its protective mechanisms worked. On the 11th day, I sat down alone in the kitchen with all 3 phones lined up on the table in front of me, and I read everything from the beginning, not selectively, not quickly, but completely and in order, taking notes in a school exercise book with a blue biro, the way I used to take notes during the Tuesday meeting for study. I gave myself the entire day. I made tea and ate a sandwich and did not stop. By the time the light faded outside, I had a reasonably complete picture of the life Leonard had constructed in parallel to ours, and I had filled 22 pages in the exercise book, and I had not cried once, which frightened me more than the contents of the phones. What I found across the 3 devices described the following. In approximate summary, Leonard had been maintaining contact with a network of men, some witnesses, some not, through an online community that had migrated between several platforms over the years. Some of these contacts were purely digital, sustained across years without physical meeting. Others were local, meaning they were within driving distance of Leamington Spa, and the evidence of actual meetings was present in location data and in the texture of the conversations, which had the specific warmth of people who had been in the same room. One contact, identified only as W on the first phone but fully named on the third, had been a consistent presence for nearly 8 years. The nature of their relationship was unmistakable. 2 of the contacts were men. Leonard had met through congregation activities, one through a regional assembly, one through the circuit arrangement. This was the detail that lodged most deeply, not because it shocked me in the abstract, but because of what it meant about the spaces I had always considered safe. The Kingdom Hall, the Assembly Hall, the circuit visits, these were the coordinates of my entire spiritual geography. The places where I had believed I was surrounded by people who shared my values, and inside those places, apparently, entirely other conversations had been taking place, in plain sight, in the language of spiritual brotherhood, in the spaces between the arranged talks and the songbooks and the contribution boxes. I want to be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying that Leonard's behavior was caused by his faith, or that everyone in a Kingdom Hall is hiding something. or that same-sex desire is inherently deceptive. What I am saying is specific. Leonard was a man who had been taught from early adulthood that a central part of his innate life was incompatible with Jehovah's standards, incompatible with congregation membership, incompatible with the resurrection hope. He had been taught this by an organization that is explicit in its literature and in its judicial processes about the treatment of what it calls sexual immorality, and he had responded to that teaching not by leaving, not by seeking help, but by going underground, and he had taken me with him as his cover without my knowledge or consent. That is the part that took me the longest to name clearly, not the infidelity, though that was real and painful, not the secrecy, though 41 years of it represents a kind of sustained cruelty that I have not yet fully processed. The deepest wound was the instrumentalization, the understanding that my marriage, my faith, my respectability, my very presence as a believing wife at Leonard's side in the 4th row of the Kingdom Hall, had been recruited as a tool in his management of a secret he had never intended to share with me. I was not his partner. I was his alibi. On the 14th day after Leonard's death, I made a call that changed the direction of everything. I telephoned my friend Sylvia, who had left the witnesses 8 years before under circumstances she had described to me only vaguely at the time, circumstances I had accepted vaguely because the congregation's counsel on associating with disfellowshipped or disassociated persons is very clear, and Sylvia had been disfellowshipped, and so our friendship had quietly reduced itself to a Christmas card and the occasional text, the minimum I could maintain without feeling I had abandoned her entirely. Sylvia answered on the 2nd ring. She did not seem surprised to hear from me, which struck me later as significant. I told her approximately what I had found, using plain language, without the softening instincts I would have applied to any conversation inside the congregation, and she listened for a long time without interrupting. When I finished, she said, with the patience that suggested she had been waiting years to be allowed to say it, that she was glad I had called, and that I should not go to the elders, and that I needed to speak with someone who understood what I was dealing with from the outside. She gave me the name and number of a counselor in Coventry who had worked extensively with people leaving high control religious groups. I did not call the counselor immediately. Old habits move slowly, and the reflex to resolve things internally had not yet fully released its grip. Instead, I did something I had not done in 40 years. I drove to a public library and spent 3 hours reading, not the Watchtower, not the Awake, not the organization's website, which presents its positions with the calm authority of an institution that has never been wrong. I read accounts written by former witnesses. I read academic work on high control groups. I read the court documents from cases in several countries, including a substantial legal action in Australia that had been ongoing for years, involving the organization's handling of abuse disclosures. I read the two-witness rule, which I had known existed but had never examined critically, the policy requiring 2 witnesses to an act of wrongdoing before a judicial committee could proceed, a policy that in practice makes the abuse of power very difficult to prosecute internally. When I drove home from the library, I was not the same woman who had driven to it. Something had cracked open in my thinking that I had not known was sealed. I do not mean I had suddenly concluded that everything I had believed was false, or that every experience I had had inside the congregation was a manipulation. I mean that I had, for the first time, read the organization's history and policies from outside the framework the organization provided for interpreting them, and what I saw was different from what I had always been told I was seeing. The elders came to visit 3 days later, 2 of them, which is standard for what they call a shepherding call on a bereaved sister. They sat in my living room and drank tea, and spoke about Leonard with great warmth, and about the resurrection hope with great certainty, and at the end, gently, one of them, Brother Calloway, who had been an elder for 15 years, and whose opinions carried weight in our congregation, mentioned that the body had been praying for me, and was available if I had any concerns. He used that word deliberately. Concerns. It was an open door, framed carefully, and I understood that he was offering me a space to raise any difficulties I might have encountered during Leonard's illness or in the immediate aftermath of his death. I sat across from him and I thought about the 3 phones in the shoebox. I thought about 8 years of conversations between Leonard and the man saved as W.I. Thought about 2 other names on those devices that I had cross-referenced with congregation members and had identified with near certainty. As men who currently served as ministerial servants in assemblies within our circuit, I thought about the judicial process that would follow if I brought this information to the elders, a process I now understood well enough to know how it would proceed. Private, internal, no civil authorities unless legally mandatory. The details managed to minimize what they call reproach on Jehovah's name, with outcomes determined by a committee of men using a standard of evidence that had been designed to protect the institution more than the individuals inside it. I told Brother Calloway that I was managing, that I was leaning on Jehovah, and that I appreciated the visit. I said all the correct things with the fluency of a woman who has been saying the correct things since she was 17 years old. And when they left, I sat in the hallway with my back against the front door, and I understood, with complete clarity, that I was never going to bring those phones to the elders. I was never going to bring any of this inside that building again. What I had found was mine to manage, mine to understand, mine to eventually release. And I was going to do it outside the system that had helped create the conditions for it. That decision cost me more than I expected. In the weeks that followed, as my attendance at meetings became irregular and then stopped, the congregation's response moved through its predictable stages with a mechanical efficiency I might have found impressive in another context. First came the concerned visits, warm and genuinely kind in the way that early-stage congregational concern always is. Then came the slightly more pointed calls, reminders of the importance of meeting attendance for spiritual strength during trials. Then came a visit from an elder I had not seen socially in years, which meant the body had formally discussed my situation, which meant I had crossed from the category of bereaved sister to the category of spiritually weak sister, a classification that carries its own subtle changes in social temperature. The sisters who had been bringing casseroles began to come less frequently. The conversation at the doors became shorter. Petra, who had been raised in the faith but had never been as deeply embedded as I was, noticed the shift before I named it to her, and described it with the blunt accuracy of someone who had always watched the congregation from a slight distance. She said it felt like the warmth had a thermostat and someone had just turned it down. She was right, and I had seen this happen to others often enough to know that if I continued on this trajectory, missing meetings, not responding to shepherding, failing to demonstrate the expected markers of spiritual recovery, the temperature would continue to drop until the day someone formally asked me where I stood. The counselor Sylvia had recommended was a woman named Patricia Vane, based in Coventry, who had a small practice above a bookshop on a street I used to walk along as a child. She was in her early 50s, and in our first session, she told me directly that she had worked with dozens of people transitioning out of high-control religious environments, including many former Jehovah's Witnesses, and that she would not be directing me toward any particular spiritual conclusion but helping me find my own thinking again. She used that phrase, your own thinking, and I remember writing it in the exercise book that evening because it struck me as something I had not considered myself to be in possession of for a very long time. The counseling process was not what I expected. I had anticipated, I think, a structured unveiling of specific wounds, the betrayal, the deception, the lost years, and instead what Patricia offered was something slower and more fundamental. She was interested in how I made decisions, not the big decisions, not the crisis decisions, but the ordinary daily ones, what I chose to read, how I responded when I felt doubt, what happened internally when I noticed something that contradicted what I had been taught. She was mapping the architecture of a mind that had been shaped inside a particular system for 50 years, and she was doing it without judgment, which was disorienting in itself because judgment, the constant internal audit of whether one's thoughts and actions measured up to organizational standards, had been the background hum of my entire inner life since I was a teenager. Of the things I began to understand in those sessions was the function of what Patricia called thought techniques, mental habits that high-control groups instill in members to interrupt critical thinking before it can develop into genuine questioning. Inside the witnesses, these are not presented as control mechanisms but as spiritual tools, the practice of immediately taking thoughts captive when doubts arise, the counsel to bring concerns to the elders rather than discuss them with other members, the strong cultural taboo around reading what the organization calls apostate material, meaning anything critical of the faith produced by former members or outside observers. I had practiced all of these techniques faithfully for decades. I had genuinely believed they were protecting me. It took many weeks of work with Patricia before I could look at them clearly as what they also were. This is not to say I left the counseling sessions having concluded that my entire spiritual life was an illusion. Faith is not a simple thing, and the community I had belonged to was not a simple thing. And the grief of deconstructing a belief system you have held since adolescence is not a simple grief. There are things I had genuinely experienced inside that faith, moments of what felt like real connection, real comfort, real meaning, that I am not willing to reduce entirely to conditioning, but I am also not willing anymore to protect those experiences by refusing to look at the container they came in. The container had serious problems, and the problems had serious consequences. One of the most difficult things I processed in those months was the question of what I had missed about Leonard, because the organizational structure had trained me to miss it, not deliberately, not as a calculated deception on the organization's part toward me specifically, but as a systemic consequence of what the witnesses teach about gender, marriage, and the appropriate limits of a wife's understanding. I had been taught that Leonard's inner life, to the extent that it differed from what he presented, was between him and Jehovah, and that my role was to support his spiritual lead rather than probe the health of the man beneath it. Headship theology, in practice, had functioned as a privacy screen around my husband, installed by the very faith that was supposed to be our shared foundation. I began, in this period, to read things I had never read before, not as an act of rebellion. I was 68 years old and had no interest in performing rebellion, but as an act of basic intellectual recovery. I read books about the history of the Watchtower Society that had been on the organizational forbidden list for years. I read the experiences of other women who had been in spiritually unequal marriages within the faith. I read the testimony of abuse survivors who had brought disclosures to congregational committees and been handled by the two-witness rule, and then been instructed not to contact authorities. Each piece of reading was uncomfortable in the way that seeing a familiar place in an unflattering photograph is uncomfortable. The discomfort of recognition rather than surprise. Petra came to visit me during this period for a long weekend, and we talked in a way we had not talked since she was a teenager. Before the congregation's counsel about keeping family conversations spiritually uplifting had quietly reshaped even my closest relationships, I told her more than I had told anyone. Not everything, not the full contents of the phones, which I decided then, and still believe is not appropriate to share with a daughter about her father, but the shape of it, the parallel life, the years, the fact that Leonard's public identity had been, in significant part, a management strategy. Petra was quieter than I expected. She had her own complicated relationship with her father that she did not fully describe but referenced in the careful way of someone who has always known something was off and never had the language for it. She said something I have thought about many times since. She said that the congregation had always reminded her of a theater, where the play was about people being happy and good, and where, if you pointed out that the actors were tired, someone would gently redirect you to watch the performance rather than the performers. I thought it was one of the most accurate descriptions of a high-control environment I had ever heard, and she had arrived at it entirely without reading any of the material I had spent months processing. I went to the Kingdom Hall one final time in the autumn of that year, about 7 months after Leonard's death. I did not go to a meeting. I went on a Tuesday morning when the building would be empty, because I had left a small item in the room where the sisters stored their literature carts, and I wanted to retrieve it without encountering anyone. I let myself in with the key that had not yet been returned and stood in the main hall for a few minutes. The chairs were in rows. The platform was empty. The literature was stacked neatly on the table by the door. It looked exactly as it had always looked, and I stood there and felt nothing that I recognized as spiritual. Only a deep, aching familiarity, the way you might feel standing in the house you grew up in after the family has moved out. It had been home. It was no longer home. The difference between those two facts was not something I could resolve, only something I had to carry. There is a thing that happens in the period after you leave a high-control religious group that no one outside the experience can quite prepare you for, which is the practical disorientation of having almost no secular social network. I was 68 years old, and the vast majority of my friendships, my routines, my community touchpoints, my sources of comfort in difficulty, and my sense of shared reference, all of it had been inside the congregation. The friends I had made in the 4 decades since my baptism were, with very few exceptions, witnesses, and the organizational guidance on association with those who have left is clear enough that most of them would have difficulty maintaining full friendship with me once my departure became formalized, whether through disfellowshipping or formal disassociation, or simply the quiet attrition of a woman who has stopped attending. I want to say something honest about this, which is that the loneliness of the first year after Leonard's death, compounded by the discoveries, the counseling, the slow deconstruction, and the organizational cooling, was the most sustained loneliness I have experienced in my adult life. More isolating, in some ways, than the early years of my marriage when Leonard was absorbed in his ministerial responsibilities. More isolating than the years when the children were young, and I was managing them largely alone, because Leonard's congregation duties filled his evenings. The loneliness of leaving a high-control group is specific because it is not just the loss of people. It is the loss of the framework through which people were understood. When you leave, you are not just attending fewer social events, you are learning to inhabit a self that was previously only permitted to exist in relation to an institutional structure, and the self that emerges from that structure is often unfamiliar to itself. I began, slowly, to find my way toward other connections. Sylvia was the first, and our renewed friendship had a quality of accumulated time that I found unexpectedly sustaining. She knew me from before the years of careful organizational friendship, and there was something in that pre-congregational knowledge of each other that felt solid. Patricia, my counselor, connected me with a support group for people exiting high-control religions, which met every second Thursday in a community center in Coventry, and which included former members of several different organizations, as well as a disproportionate number of former witnesses, because we are, statistically, heavily represented in these spaces. The support group was the most useful thing that happened to me in that first year, more useful in some respects than the individual counseling, because it gave me the experience of speaking in a room full of people who understood institutional shame, that specific flavor of self-doubt that comes not from personal failure but from having been, without your full awareness, managed by an institution that prioritized its own continuity over the wholeness of its members. People in that room had lost children to shunning. People had lost their marriages when one spouse left and the other stayed. People had spent decades in a world with very specific edges and were now learning, in their 40s and 50s and 60s, to navigate without them. I was not the oldest person in the room. I was not even the most recently bereaved, but I was, for the first time in many years, not managing my perceptions in order to remain acceptable to a community. I was simply in a room, being myself, without editing. The question of Leonard is one I am still working with, and I expect I will be working with it for the rest of my life. And I have made a kind of peace with that expectation. I did not speak with any of the people I identified from the phones. I considered it and decided against it, not out of forgiveness in any formal sense, but out of a recognition that those men had their own reckonings to navigate, and that inserting myself into them would serve my anger more than my healing. I did write a letter to Leonard, a real letter, on paper, that I wrote over the course of 3 evenings and then burned in the garden, in which I said everything I had not been permitted or not permitted myself to say in 41 years. The burning was not ceremonial. It was practical. I did not want the letter to exist in the world, only to have been written. What I have arrived at, 14 months after Leonard's death, and 11 months after those phones cracked my life in two, is not resolution in the sense of having reached settled conclusions about faith or marriage or the nature of deception. I am 68 years old and I have decided that settled conclusions are less interesting than live questions, which is itself a departure from a faith that organized itself around the certainty of answers. I no longer believe everything I was taught. I am not yet certain what I believe instead. I have found that this intermediate space, which the witness community would identify as spiritually dangerous, is actually livable, and that the discomfort of genuine uncertainty is categorically different from the discomfort of managed certainty, which I now understand to have been the primary texture of my inner life for 50 years. I have rediscovered things I had forgotten about myself, that I read very quickly and hungrily, when no one is monitoring what I read, that I have opinions about things, political things, cultural things, personal things that are not derived from a publication's current teaching, but from observation and experience, and the kind of thinking that happens when you are not required to arrive at pre-approved conclusions, that I find cooking genuinely pleasurable when I am not making it for an elder's visit, that I can sit in a Church of England church, the kind with flowers on the windowsills and mismatched needlers, and feel something that resembles what I used to feel at meetings, without the structure that used to tell me what the feeling meant. Bafta and I speak on the telephone every Sunday morning now, which is something we had never done before. She lives in Glasgow and I live in Warwickshire, and for most of her adult life, the distance between us was not only geographic. She does not follow any particular faith and has never pressed me to abandon mine. And the ease of that, the freedom to be in process without being managed, is something I recognize as a gift. Even on the days when the process is painful, I found 3 phones in my dead husband's drawer and wardrobe. The world they described undid everything I thought I knew about my marriage and challenged the foundation of my faith and demonstrated that the community I had trusted most completely was not capable of holding the truth of what had happened inside it. And I am still here. I am 68 years old, and I am still here, and I am learning. At an age when most people expect the questions to be settling, how to begin. I did not tell this story because I wanted pity, and I did not tell it to damage anyone's faith, and I did not tell it to settle scores with an institution, or with a dead man who cannot respond. I told it because I spent the largest portion of my life being taught that silence was holy and that a good woman managed her perceptions to fit the framework she had been given. And at 68, with my knees aching and my garden needing work and a life that is uncharted in the most literal sense, I have come to believe that silence is only holy when it is chosen freely, and that the framework matters as much as what you put inside it. Leonard built a framework of appearances and asked me to live in it without knowing its actual dimensions. The organization I gave my faith to built a similar kind of framework and called it the truth. I am done living inside structures that were not built for my wholeness. If you are somewhere in the middle of a story like this, 1. If you are a woman in a congregation who has noticed things and trained herself not to notice, if you are a man performing a spiritual identity that costs you something real every single day, if you are a young person being told that your questions are the enemy of your faith, I want you to know that the questions are not the danger. The questions are the most honest thing about you. The danger is the long habit of silencing them. I know how deep that habit runs because I lived it for 50 years. And I know what it costs. And I know that it is possible, even late, even when the life you thought you had has come apart in your hands, to begin building something that actually belongs to you. Thank you for sitting with me through this. If this story reached you, truly reached you, in the way that only a real thing can, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are in the world. Tell me if any of this mirrors something you have lived. The fact that you are here, listening, means that you are already doing the bravest thing, which is paying attention to a truth that is larger and stranger and more survivable than you were told.